In October 1958, a thin, bespectacled man in a modest dacha outside Moscow received a telegram that many writers dream of and few ever see. The Swedish Academy informed him that he had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his important achievement both in contemporary lyrical poetry and in the field of the great Russian epic tradition. His name was Boris Pasternak. The book that had earned him this honor was Dr. Zhivago, a sweeping novel of love, revolution, and moral choice that his own government had branded dangerous and refused to publish. Within days, that same man would be forced to send another telegram, this time to Stockholm, telling the Academy that he must decline the prize. "Considering the meaning this award has acquired in the society to which I belong," he wrote, "I must reject this undeserved distinction which has been conferred upon me." The language was stiff and unnatural, a product of intense pressure from Soviet authorities. Around the world, people understood what had happened. A great writer had been bullied by a regime that feared his book, and feared even more what it meant that the free world could celebrate him and his work when his own country could not. To understand why Dr. Zhivago became such a flashpoint in the Cold War, you have to go back to the world that shaped Boris Pasternak and the way his novel was born into conflict between two systems. Boris Leonidovich Pasternak was born in 1980 into a prominent artistic family in Moscow. His father, Leonid Pasternak, was a well-known painter who illustrated works by Tolstoy, and his mother was a concert pianist. He grew up surrounded by writers, composers, and artists, steeped in Russian and European culture. As a young man, he studied philosophy in Germany and then turned to poetry, becoming one of the leading poets of the Russian Silver Age. His early work was acclaimed for its dense imagery and spiritual intensity. Even after the Bolshevik Revolution, he tried to keep his distance from politics, focusing on lyric poetry and translation. The new Soviet state, however, had other ideas about the role of a writer. In the 1920s and 1930s, the regime demanded that literature serve the goals of socialism, promoting socialist realism and punishing those who strayed from the line. Pasternak survived the purges of that era, in part by keeping a low profile and by doing translations of Shakespeare, Goethe, and other classics, work that was valued but less politically dangerous. He saw friends and fellow writers arrested, exiled, and executed. He understood what it meant when the state decided a book or a person was hostile. In the 1940s and early 1950s, as Stalin's rule continued and then gave way to the uneasy thaw under Nikita Khrushchev, Pasternak began work on a large novel. He wanted to write about the experience of the Russian intelligentsia, the moral and spiritual impact of revolution and civil war, and the fate of individuals caught between historical forces and personal conscience. The result, completed in the mid-1950s, was Dr. Zhivago. Dr. Zhivago follows Yuri Zhivago, a doctor and poet, through the upheavals of World War I, the 1917 Revolution, the Civil War, and the early Soviet period. It portrays the Bolshevik Revolution not as a glorious liberation, but as a complex, often tragic process that crushes individuals and distorts ideals. The novel is filled with doubt, religious imagery, and a sense that history can destroy as much as it creates. It does not glorify the party or the new socialist order. In the eyes of Soviet censors, this was intolerable. In 1956, Pasternak submitted the manuscript to the Soviet literary journal Novy Mir. The editors, sympathetic but cautious, passed it up to higher authorities. In 1957, the official Soviet publisher rejected the book outright. Internal reports called it anti-Soviet, claimed it distorted the revolution, and warned that publishing it would damage the ideological image of Soviet literature. Pasternak was told that the novel could not be printed in the USSR. At this point, the story takes on a distinctly Cold War character. a copy of the Russian-language manuscript reached an Italian communist intellectual, Sergio D'Angelo, who was working for the Italian publisher Giacomo Feltrinelli. D'Angelo traveled to Peridelkino, the writers' colony outside Moscow where Pasternak lived, and asked him directly if he would allow Feltrinelli to publish Dr. Zhivago. Pasternak, fully aware that Soviet authorities had banned the book, said yes. He reportedly told D'Angelo, "You are hereby invited to my execution." Feltrinelli smuggled the manuscript out of the Soviet Union and prepared it for publication. In November 1957, Il Dottor Zhivago came out in Italian. It was the first time the novel appeared anywhere in print. Western critics quickly recognized its importance as a work of literature and as a rare, independent Soviet perspective on the revolution. Soviet authorities were furious. They pressured Pasternak to demand that Feltrinelli halt foreign editions, but the Italian publisher refused. Meanwhile, publishers in other countries sought rights for their own translations. The Kremlin, which had wanted the book silenced, now saw it spreading across Europe and America, beyond its control. In Washington, the CIA took notice. Declassified documents and later reporting show that the agency's Soviet Russia division saw Dr. Zhivago as a potent propaganda weapon. Here was a novel by a respected Soviet writer, banned at home, that depicted the revolution and its aftermath in a way that undercut official Soviet narratives. If Russians could read it in their own language, it might shake their faith in the system. The CIA developed a plan. Working through front organizations and allied services, it obtained a copy of the Russian-language manuscript and printed a small, pocket-sized edition in Cyrillic. One of the most famous distribution points was the 1958 Brussels World's Fair. The Soviet Union had a large pavilion there, showcasing its industrial and technological achievements, rockets, machinery, models of hydroelectric plants, designed to impress foreigners and to show that the USSR could compete with the US in science and industry. Near that pavilion, the CIA and its partners set up a small stall inside the Vatican Pavilion where they quietly handed out Russian-language copies of Dr. Zhivago to Soviet visitors. The idea was simple and brilliant. Give Soviet citizens something their own government had denied them in their own language in full. For a Soviet reader who had been told that the West was technologically advanced but morally decadent and spiritually empty, receiving a banned book under the shadow of rockets and atom displays sent a powerful message. The West had not only cars and computers, but also the freedom to print and read what it wanted. At the same time, Dr. Zhivago was being translated and published in English, French, German, and other languages, turning Pasternak into a world-famous novelist. Critics praised the book's artistry and its emotional depth. They noted its non-Marxist worldview and its spiritual dimension, elements that resonated in the West as a counterpoint to Soviet materialist ideology. In this context, the Swedish Academy's decision in 1958 to award Pasternak the Nobel Prize in Literature was explosive. The Nobel Committee cited his poetry and Dr. Zhivago as a great modern epic in the Russian tradition. From Stockholm's point of view, it was a literary judgment, but in the Cold War climate, it was inevitably political. The Nobel would spotlight a Russian writer whose major work had been banned by his own state, and it would implicitly criticize the Soviet system's control over culture. When the news reached the USSR, the initial response was mixed. Some in the Soviet cultural apparatus reportedly considered allowing Pasternak to accept, hoping to spin it positively, but the party leadership, led by Khrushchev, quickly chose confrontation. Soviet media launched a coordinated campaign against Pasternak, denouncing him as a traitor and a literary hooligan. The Writers' Union expelled him. Pravda and other organs attacked Dr. Zhivago as slander. Behind the scenes, the pressure was brutal. According to accounts and documents, Pasternak was summoned to official offices and told that if he accepted the Nobel and traveled abroad, he would be stripped of his citizenship and barred from returning to the USSR. He was warned that his family, the woman he lived with, Olga Ivinskaya, and their children could face arrest or worse. Colleagues were forced to sign letters condemning him. Posters appeared calling for his expulsion from the country. Under this intensifying pressure, Pasternak cracked. On October 29, 1958, he sent a telegram to the Swedish Academy stating, "Considering the meaning this award has acquired in the society to which I belong, I must reject this undeserved distinction." The phrasing was clearly influenced by Soviet demands. It allowed Moscow to claim that he had come to his senses and rejected the politicized Nobel, but worldwide people saw it for what it was, a coerced refusal. The episode caused a sensation. The New York Times ran front-page stories on the Pasternak affair, describing it as a case that emphasizes Moscow's dilemma in trying to maintain control over intellectuals while projecting a post-Stalin image. Cultural figures across Europe and America protested his treatment. For the West, the image of a state so afraid of a novelist that it would force him to reject the world's most prestigious literary award became a potent symbol of the difference between the two systems. What makes this story uniquely Cold War and resonant for an American audience is the way it shows both the Soviet fear of free art and the Western ability to turn that fear into a strategic advantage. On the Soviet side, Dr. Zhivago was treated like a dangerous weapon, something that had to be locked away, its author humiliated, its readers denied. On the Western side, especially in the United States, it was literally used as a weapon of information. The CIA's role in printing and distributing the Russian-language edition of Dr. Zhivago shows how deeply American policymakers understood the power of ideas and the importance of technology in spreading them. The agency had access to advanced printing techniques that allowed it to produce small, high-quality books that could be concealed and carried easily. It leveraged the State Department's presence at international events, like the Brussels Expo, and the unique environments of Western embassies and pavilions to get those books into Soviet hands. In an era when the Soviet Union tried to control every printed page within its borders, the United States used its global reach, its publishing industry, and its intelligence infrastructure to bypass those controls. The contrast extends further. In the United States and Western Europe, readers could buy Dr. Zhivago openly, read it, argue about it, adapt it, even turn it into a major Hollywood film in 1965 with all the production values and emotional impact that American cinema could bring. That film, although made years after Pasternak's death, reached millions more people with its portrayal of a Russia where ordinary human love and integrity were crushed by ideological machinery. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, the book remained banned for decades, officially unpublishable until 1988 under Gorbachev. Boris Pasternak did not live to see that rehabilitation. After the Nobel affair, he lived out his last years under a cloud. The Writers' Union expulsion cut him off from official publication and most public life. He continued to write poetry privately and to work on translations, but he was careful not to give the state further pretexts to punish him or his loved ones. He died in May 1960 at his dacha in Peredelkino. Thousands of admirers attended his funeral despite official pressure to stay away, reciting his banned verses and signaling that his moral authority outlived any campaign against him. Under Gorbachev's glasnost, Dr. Zhivago was finally published legally in the Soviet Union. The Russian edition came out in 1988, over 30 years after the novel had appeared in the West. In 1989, the Soviet Writers' Union posthumously reinstated Pasternak's membership. In 1989 and 1990, the Nobel diploma and medal were formally delivered to his son in a ceremony in Moscow, symbolically closing a circle that had been violently broken in 1958. For an American viewer, this story captures a different dimension of the Cold War than tanks and missiles. It is about the power of culture and the infrastructures that carry it. The United States and its allies had built powerful technological and logistical systems for moving information, global publishing houses, international book fairs, radio stations like Radio Liberty,
film studios, and, behind the scenes, intelligence agencies with printing presses and distribution networks. The Soviet Union, by contrast, built elaborate censorship organs, printing monopolies, and border controls to keep unwanted ideas out and to keep its own citizens' words in. Dr. Zhivago became a test case. Could a book that the Soviet state declared dangerous be kept from Soviet readers forever? The answer, eventually, was no. The West's technological and institutional advantage in spreading information, its ability to print, translate, smuggle, and broadcast, meant that a Soviet novel could be read by the world, celebrated, and even used in psychological operations, while the regime that had produced its author was reduced to threatening him and denying that he had earned his prize. For Boris Pasternak himself, the cost was terrible. He bore the brunt of the state's anger. He was forced into an act of public self-denial, rejecting an honor he clearly valued. He was made to watch as his friends condemned him under pressure, and as his work was smeared in his own country. Yet, over time, the moral balance shifted. Today, Dr. Zhivago is read around the world as one of the great novels of the 20th century, and Pasternak is remembered as a writer who, without leaving his country or taking up politics, revealed the hollowness of a state that feared his art. In the wider story of the Cold War, his case sits alongside that of scientists like Andrei Sakharov and defectors like Svetlana Alliluyeva and Arkady Shevchenko, people who from within the Soviet system produced or carried truths that the West could amplify and the Soviet regime could not fully contain. In Pasternak's case, the technology that caused so much alarm was not a new radar or jet, but the simple, reproducible machinery of printing and publishing, deployed in a way that made clear which side trusted its own people with difficult truths. When you look at the moment in 1958, when the world's most prestigious literary prize was offered to a Soviet poet and then snatched away by his own government, you can feel both the fear in Moscow and the quiet confidence in Washington, London, Rome, and Stockholm. One system believed it had to break a man to keep control of a book. The other system believed that if you put that book into as many hands as possible, even into the hands of the author's own countrymen at a World's Fair, truth and art would do the rest.